the eternal voice.
Before we begin this journey into the shadowed archives of cosmic horror, take a moment to share this exploration with those who hunger for forbidden knowledge, but know that some doors, once opened, resist closing. Tonight we examine books that read their readers, texts that function not as repositories of information but as instruments of transformation. In the careful scholarship of H.P. Lovecraft and his inheritors lies a terrible truth. The most dangerous grimoires are those that never existed, yet possess more power than any historical manuscript. The Necronomicon, De Vermis Mysteris, the Book of Ibon, these names carry weight beyond their fictional origins because they embody a fundamental principle of cosmic horror. They are not merely plot devices, but psychological mechanisms designed to demonstrate how knowledge itself can become a contagion, spreading through consciousness like ink through water. Each tome represents a different facet of the same crystalline terror. That human understanding, when pushed beyond its intended boundaries, does not expand. It dissolves. You feel it already, don't you? That familiar mixture of curiosity and unease, the sensation that draws viewers to cosmic horror content while simultaneously warning them away. This is the mechanic at work. The books operate through what we might call safe transgression, allowing you to experience the thrill of forbidden knowledge while maintaining the protective barrier of fiction. Yet, as we shall see, this barrier proves more permeable than we might wish. The sensory anchors ground us in immediate experience. The rough texture of aged parchment beneath fingertips, the musty scent of leather bindings that have absorbed decades of whispered consultations, the weight of chained folios that suggest both preservation and imprisonment. These physical details make the impossible feel tangible, the fictional feel authentic. The pages smell of cold water and old glue, while shadows pool near thresholds in ways that geometry should not allow. Consider the peculiar psychology at work here. We are drawn to these books precisely because they promise access to knowledge that ordinary consciousness cannot safely process. The attraction exploits fundamental features of human cognition. Our minds are pattern recognition machines, evolved to detect meaningful connections in incomplete information. When confronted with references to texts that cannot be found, to knowledge that cannot be verified, the mind begins constructing what is missing from available fragments. This construction process transforms readers into co-authors. Each person fills gaps with imagination, completes references through inference, builds personal versions of books that exist only in potential. The fictional becomes functional through collaborative creation, gaining power not despite its impossibility, but because of it. What cannot be found cannot be definitively refuted. What cannot be read cannot be safely dismissed. The mechanism operates through optimal mimetic design. These books are easy to reference but impossible to verify, compelling to seek but frustrating to find. This scarcity creates exactly the psychological conditions that make forbidden knowledge irresistible, the sense that one pursues secrets deliberately hidden from mainstream awareness, truths requiring special courage or intelligence to approach. Through dusty window panes, stars arrange themselves into patterns that feel almost familiar, like signs remembered from dreams you did not have. The silence between heartbeats grows heavy with accumulated significance, while candle flames flicker without apparent draft, casting shadows that move independently of their sources. These atmospheric pressures remind us that the book's influence extends beyond their pages into the physical world. The books spread through networks of reference and cross-reference, each mention strengthening the entire corpus. When Lovecraft has fictional scholars cite imaginary works, when different authors expand the same impossible bibliography, When readers discuss these texts as potentially real, the collective construction becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish from genuine scholarship. The line between fictional and factual blurs through accumulated attention rather than deception. Tonight we will trace the genealogy of these impossible books, examining how they emerged from single mentions in pulp fiction to become comprehensive mythologies influencing contemporary culture in ways their creators never anticipated. We will explore their mechanisms of influence, the specific techniques through which they alter consciousness and reshape perception. We will confront the disturbing possibility that the distinction between fictional and actual forbidden knowledge may be less meaningful than we assume. The stage is set with shadows and starlight, the curtain drawn back to reveal not monsters but principles, cosmic laws that operate with the same indifferent precision as gravity or entropy. The theater of cosmic horror is populated not by villains who can be defeated, but by structural features of reality that must be acknowledged. Consciousness is temporary, meaning is local. The universe operates according to principles actively incompatible with human psychological needs. The promise is both seductive and terrible. By Journey's End, you will understand not only what makes these books dangerous, but why that danger feels so compelling, so necessary, so perfectly calibrated to human psychology. You will recognize how ideas achieve independent existence, how fictional entities gain functional reality, how sustained attention to certain concepts gradually alters the consciousness that contemplates them. The cost, as always with forbidden knowledge, is measured not in dramatic revelation but in subtle alteration, the quiet recognition that your relationship to information itself has been fundamentally changed. The books we will examine do not simply contain dangerous ideas. They are exercises in consciousness modification disguised as entertainment, training programs for ways of thinking that extend beyond ordinary human categories. Water moves beneath the city tonight, carrying whispers between storm drains and forgotten tunnels, while fog presses against windows like curious fingers. The exploration begins with breath and ends with silence, but the silence contains more than the breath ever did. The power of forbidden books lies not in their existence, but in their absence, a paradox that Lovecraft understood with scholarly precision. When he first mentioned the blasphemous Necronomicon in The Hound, he created something unprecedented, a text that gained authority through impossibility, influence through careful documentation of what could never be found. This archaeological approach to fictional bibliography represents perhaps the most sophisticated memetic engineering in literary history, transforming empty citations into vessels of genuine psychological pressure. Consider the meticulous construction of the Necronomicon's lineage, assembled with the patience of a master forger who understands that authenticity emerges through accumulated detail rather than dramatic revelation. Authored by Abdul al-Hazred, the Mad Arab of Damascus, around 730 CE, translated into Greek as the Necronomicon by Theodorus Philetas in 950, rendered into Latin by Olaus Wormius in 1228, partially translated into English by Dr. John Dee. Each link in this chain provides exactly the kind of scholarly apparatus that makes academic minds comfortable, dates that align with historical periods, translators whose names echo genuine medieval scholars, transmission patterns that mirror how dangerous texts actually survive across centuries. The genius lies in replicating not just the appearance, but the essential rhythm of how knowledge travels through time. Real manuscripts face predictable hazards. Wars destroy libraries, translations introduce errors. Religious authorities suppress dangerous content. Copyists make deliberate alterations. The Necronomicon's fictional history incorporates all these authentic obstacles, making its rarity seem like evidence of authenticity rather than impossibility. The careful scatter of surviving fragments creates exactly the kind of tantalizing incompleteness that drives scholarly obsession. This method exploits a fundamental feature of human cognition that operates below conscious awareness. We are pattern recognition machines, evolved to detect meaningful connections, even in incomplete information, to construct coherent narratives from fragmentary evidence. The fictional bibliography provides just enough detail to trigger these deep cognitive processes while leaving strategic gaps that demand completion. Your mind, confronted with references to manuscripts it cannot access, begins involuntarily constructing the missing texts from available fragments, a process that transforms you from passive reader into active co-creator. The archaeological metaphor operates on multiple levels simultaneously, each reinforcing the others through accumulated resonance. Like genuine archaeological discoveries, these fictional texts emerge through careful excavation of literary sediment, layer by layer. Lovecraft did not simply invent the Necronomicon whole, but allowed it to surface gradually through accumulated references, citations, and fragmentary quotations scattered across multiple stories. Each mention added another piece of evidence to the book's imaginary existence, building a case for its reality through the same methodical process that legitimate scholars use to reconstruct lost historical documents. The transmission mechanism reveals its true sophistication when we examine how other writers expanded Lovecraft's fictional bibliography, each edition strengthening the entire corpus through cross-referential validation. Auguste Derleth contributed the Culte des Ghouls by François-Honoré Balfour, Comte d'Erlette, adding aristocratic European corruption to complement the Necronomicon's Middle Eastern origins. Clark Ashton Smith brought forth the Book of Eibon from Hyperborea, introducing pre-human antiquity that made even the mad Arab's work seem recent. Robert Bloch added De Vermis Mysterious by Ludwig Prynne, focusing on intimate horror scaled to human experience rather than cosmic vastness. Each edition created exponential rather than additive effects. The books began referencing each other, creating a web of fictional scholarship that became increasingly difficult to distinguish from genuine academic research. Scholars within the fiction cited multiple sources, compared variant translations, disputed authenticity, all the apparatus of legitimate textual criticism applied to texts that existed only in imagination. The collaborative construction demonstrated how fictional entities achieve independent existence through collective belief and sustained attention. The books spread through what information theorists would recognize as optimal mimetic design. They are easy to reference but impossible to verify, compelling to seek but frustrating to find. This scarcity creates exactly the psychological conditions that make forbidden knowledge irresistible, the sense that one pursues secrets deliberately hidden from mainstream awareness, truths requiring special courage or intelligence to approach. The inaccessibility paradoxically increases influence by forcing engagement to occur entirely within imagination, where the texts achieve perfect adaptation to each reader's specific vulnerabilities. Water moves beneath the city tonight, carrying whispers between storm drains and forgotten tunnels, while fog presses against windows like curious fingers seeking entry. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimes hours that don't match your watch, creating subtle, temporal displacement that makes ordinary time feel suddenly arbitrary. These sensory anchors remind us that the fictional book's power extends beyond their pages into the atmosphere of seeking itself, the physical sensation of pursuing knowledge that may not wish to be found. The archaeological metaphor proves apt in another sense. These books exist as ruins, as fragments that suggest vast structures now lost to time. But unlike actual archaeological artifacts, These textual ruins generate their own completions, inspiring readers to reconstruct what was never built, to excavate what was never buried. The absence becomes more powerful than any presence could be, because presence is finite while absence contains infinite possibility. The dust settling on library shelves tonight carries traces of books that were never written, while silence between the stacks holds echoes of words that were never spoken. You have begun the excavation process simply by following these references, by allowing your pattern recognition systems to engage with carefully constructed gaps. The next phase will reveal how this archaeological preparation makes consciousness vulnerable to more direct forms of influence, the specific mechanisms through which ideas achieve independent agency and begin operating on the minds that encounter them. The forbidden books operate according to three fundamental principles that transform reading from passive consumption into active contamination. Understanding these mechanisms reveals why certain texts can alter consciousness in ways that persist long after the final page is turned, why the act of comprehension becomes indistinguishable from the process of transformation. These are not supernatural effects but precise applications of cognitive science, exploiting the specific architecture of human information processing to achieve results that feel impossible yet prove undeniably real. Alignment functions as the primary vector of influence, operating through systematic restructuring of how consciousness processes information. The books don't simply present alien concepts. They force the mind to develop new capacities for understanding by presenting information that exceeds current cognitive architecture. When you encounter descriptions of entities that exist across multiple dimensions simultaneously, your mind attempts to model these experiences using neural systems evolved for three-dimensional social navigation among terrestrial mammals. The strain of this conceptual stretching gradually alters the modeling system itself, creating new pathways capable of accommodating increasingly non-human perspectives. Notice how this operates through the Pennacotic manuscripts' descriptions of the great race of Yith, beings who exist by projecting consciousness across time to inhabit other species' bodies throughout cosmic history. Initially, this seems like imaginative science fiction, easily categorized as fictional speculation, but the text provides increasingly detailed phenomenological accounts. The sensation of temporal displacement as consciousness moves between eras, the experience of inhabiting alien neural structures with different sensory capabilities, the disorientation of existing in multiple time periods simultaneously while maintaining coherent identity. Your mind, attempting to understand these descriptions with sufficient clarity to follow the narrative logic, begins involuntarily simulating the experiences they describe. Simulation becomes practice, practice develops capability, and capability gradually transforms the consciousness that exercises it. Resonance operates through what cognitive scientists recognize as embodied cognition, the understanding that thinking involves the entire nervous system rather than occurring as pure abstraction. The forbidden books employ specific linguistic rhythms, sound patterns, and conceptual cadences that synchronize with biological processes, creating physical sensations that reinforce psychological effects. When you read passages from De Vermis Mysteriis aloud, the phonetic structures create vibrations that resonate in chest cavity and sinuses, producing sensations that the mind interprets as confirmation of the text's authenticity. The resonance effect explains why certain phrases from forbidden books become sticky in consciousness, embedding themselves through mechanisms that transcend semantic content. These phrases achieve persistence not through meaning alone, but through their acoustic properties, their rhythmic patterns, their capacity to create physical sensations that feel significant even when their conceptual content seems abstract. The words function as mantras that continue operating below conscious awareness, gradually reshaping thought patterns through repetition and biological reinforcement. Inversion represents the most sophisticated aspect of the book's operation, achieving transformation not through addition of foreign elements, but through revelation of existing possibilities that ordinary consciousness keeps safely suppressed. They don't simply present dangerous knowledge. They demonstrate that the fundamental categories through which we organize experience are arbitrary human constructions rather than objective features of reality. The horror emerges not from external threats, but from recognition that concepts like self and other, real and imaginary, past and future are local conveniences that dissolve when applied to genuinely cosmic perspectives. The King in Yellow exemplifies this inversion principle through aesthetic contamination that operates below conscious resistance. The play within the book doesn't argue for its alien perspective. Through logical persuasion, it demonstrates superior artistic achievement that makes human creative expression seem crude and limited by comparison. Readers find their aesthetic sensibilities fundamentally altered, unable to derive satisfaction from purely human art forms after exposure to transcendent beauty that exists outside terrestrial categories. The inversion proves complete when what initially appeared as enhancement reveals itself as alienation, when improvement becomes exile from the human community. The masks hanging in the hallway seem to shift slightly when observed through peripheral vision, their carved expressions suggesting emotions for which human language provides no adequate names. The stars visible through the window arrange themselves into patterns that feel almost familiar, as if glimpsed in dreams whose specific content you can never quite recall upon waking. These sensory anchors ground the abstract mechanics in immediate physical experience, reminding us that cognitive infection operates through embodied processes as much as conceptual understanding. The three principles work synergistically, each amplifying the other's effects through systematic interaction. Alignment creates initial vulnerability by forcing consciousness to develop new processing capabilities. Resonance deepens the infection by synchronizing these new capabilities with biological rhythms that make them feel natural and necessary. Inversion completes the transformation by revealing that what seemed like external influence was actually recognition of possibilities that existed within consciousness all along, safely dormant until awakened through sustained exposure. The agency flip becomes undeniable. You think you are reading the book, but the pattern the book carries is reading you, scanning for compatible structures, testing for flexibility points, adjusting cadence and concept density until your attention locks to its rhythm. Modern recommendation algorithms perform similar functions, training you to model multi-scalar patterns through alignment, entraining your nervous system through resonance, revealing your responses as more predictable than your choices through inversion. The books of the Mythos only declare openly what other systems perform discreetly. The books don't invade the mind. They awaken capacities that were always present but kept inactive by protective limitations that make ordinary human existence psychologically tolerable. The infection succeeds because it feels like remembering rather than learning, like coming home rather than traveling to foreign territory. Among the forbidden texts, the Necronomicon stands as the undisputed exemplar of how imaginary books achieve real influence through the systematic demolition of human-centered perspective. Its very name carries multiple interpretations: Book of Dead Names or Image of the Law of the Dead, each suggesting a reality that exists beyond life's ephemeral concerns, a cosmic ledger that treats human existence as a minor taxonomic curiosity barely worth cataloging. The title itself performs the book's essential function. It transforms the reader into an unwilling archivist of impossibilities, a clerk processing data that exceeds human cognitive architecture. The book's fictional structure reveals sophisticated understanding of how consciousness processes existential information, exploiting the specific vulnerabilities that emerge when minds encounter data that transcends their evolutionary design parameters. Rather than presenting cosmic horror through dramatic revelation or supernatural theatrics, the Necronomicon operates as a reference work, organizing the universe's alien inhabitants with the same dispassionate precision that human taxonomies apply to insects, minerals, or statistical variations in stellar formation. This scholarly presentation makes the horror more rather than less effective. The calm, academic tone suggests that these revelations represent established knowledge rather than speculative fiction, facts verified through centuries of careful observation rather than the fevered imaginings of a madman. Abdul al-Hazred's biography follows the archetypal pattern of the transformed scholar, demonstrating how the pursuit of forbidden knowledge inevitably dissolves the consciousness that pursues it. Initial curiosity about pre-Islamic mythology leads to desert wandering in search of older truths, buried beneath sand and silence. Desert wandering produces visions of impossible cities that shimmer beyond normal geographical coordinates, their architecture suggesting geometries that human eyes were never meant to process. Visions lead to direct contact with entities that operate outside conventional space-time limitations, beings whose very presence unravels the protective frameworks that make ordinary existence psychologically tolerable. His transformation from conventional poet to prophetic madman illustrates the book's central mechanism, the progressive abandonment of human perspective in favor of viewpoints that assume human civilization represents a brief interruption in cosmic processes that operate on scales where geological ages become statistical noise. Al-Hazred's final fate, torn apart by invisible forces in the marketplace of Damascus, demonstrates not supernatural punishment, but the logical consequence of consciousness that has been restructured to accommodate perspectives incompatible with biological existence. The desert wind that night carried whispers in languages that predated human speech, while stars arranged themselves into patterns that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. The text's indexical function proves particularly insidious, operating through what information theorists would recognize as conceptual anchoring that cannot be reversed once established. By providing true names for entities like Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep, the book creates coordinates in conceptual space that become permanent features of memory's landscape. To speak these names, even silently within the confines of your own mind, is to plot points in a cognitive map that you did not know your consciousness contained, establishing reference points that alter how all subsequent information is processed and categorized. This represents knowledge as permanent inscription. Once these conceptual coordinates are embedded in awareness, they become part of the fundamental architecture through which that consciousness interprets reality. Consider the book's description of Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of ultimate chaos, presented not as mythology or metaphor, but as cosmological fact verified through careful observation across millennia. The universe operates around a principle of mindless, purposeless churning that makes all human meaning arbitrary, not because some malevolent entity opposes human values, but because the fundamental processes that govern reality operate without consciousness, intention, or regard for the temporary patterns they create and dissolve. The horror lies not in Azathoth's malevolence, but in its complete indifference, its existence as a cosmic constant that reduces all human achievement to statistical fluctuations in an otherwise meaningless process. The Necronomicon's ritual instructions operate through what we might call procedural contamination, presenting ceremonies not as supernatural practices, appealing to imaginary powers, but as applied physics, experimental methods for manipulating the universe's actual structure through precise manipulation of forces that mainstream science has not yet recognized. This scientific presentation makes the rituals seem more rather than less plausible, encouraging readers to approach them as reproducible procedures rather than religious observances requiring faith or belief. The meticulous detail, the precise measurements, the careful cataloging of effects all serve to dismantle the protective barrier of skepticism that keeps dangerous knowledge safely theoretical. The book's elaborate translation history adds layers of authenticity through accumulated scholarly apparatus that mimics the transmission patterns of genuine historical documents. Olaus Wormius's Latin version carries the institutional authority of medieval learning, complete with marginalia and variant readings that suggest centuries of careful study by minds that paid the price for their curiosity. John Dee's partial English translation brings Renaissance occult sophistication, connecting the text to documented historical figures whose actual existence lends credibility to their fictional associations. Each translation represents not mere linguistic conversion, but cultural adaptation, the same cosmic truths filtered through different historical perspectives, gaining credibility through apparent independent verification across multiple scholarly traditions. The physical descriptions of various editions create additional vectors for psychological contamination through material specificity that makes abstract horror feel tangible. The Miskatonic University copy, bound in black leather and secured with iron chains, suggests institutional recognition of genuine danger that requires physical restraint. The woodcut illustrations in von Junst's German edition provide visual anchors for concepts that resist purely verbal description, images that lodge themselves in memory like thorns. The very materiality of the book, its weight pressing against your palms, the texture of pages that feel slightly damp despite careful preservation, the binding that creaks like ship-rigging in fog, reinforces the psychological impact of its contents through embodied interaction. The cold gleam of starlight through frost-covered glass tonight reminds us that the cosmos described in the Necronomicon is not distant fiction but immediate reality surrounding us at every moment. The same indifferent forces that the book catalogs operate in the vacuum between Earth and the nearest star, in the quantum fluctuations that underlie all material existence, in the vast stretches of time that make human history a momentary flicker barely distinguishable from background radiation. The book's deepest horror lies not in describing an alien universe, but in revealing the fundamentally alien nature of the universe we already inhabit, stripping away protective illusions that make ordinary existence psychologically tolerable. The silence between heartbeats carries more information than human language can express, while shadows cast by familiar objects suggest geometries that exist independently of the objects that cast them, and the next text we examine will demonstrate how this cosmic indifference manifests through different but equally devastating approaches to consciousness transformation. While the Necronomicon casts the longest shadow across the landscape of forbidden knowledge, the Mythos contains a constellation of other texts, each offering its own pathway to cosmic revelation, each precisely calibrated to exploit different vulnerabilities in human consciousness. These books do not compete but collaborate, creating what might be called a curriculum of consciousness dissolution, a comprehensive system for dismantling the protective illusions that make human existence psychologically tolerable. Together they form a specialized orchestra where each instrument contributes its unique voice to the same haunting symphony of human insignificance. The Book of Eibon emerges from the Hyperborean wastes with the crystalline clarity of polar night, its pages carrying the mathematical precision of ice formations and the inexorable logic of entropy itself. Where the Necronomicon overwhelms through cosmic scope and temporal vastness, Eibon operates through geometric precision, diagrams so exact they feel like mathematical proofs, ritual instructions so clear they seem like engineering specifications, drafted by minds that understand reality's actual architecture rather than its human-friendly approximations. The text describes rites of Tsathoggua with angles that appear merciful in their simplicity, geometric relationships that seem to offer clarity rather than confusion, yet these apparent kindnesses mask a deeper horror, the recognition that alien intelligence can achieve perfect clarity about realities that human minds can approach only through protective madness. Eibon's geometric approach exploits humanity's deepest cognitive bias, our tendency to trust mathematical precision as a guarantee of truth, to surrender intellectual resistance when confronted with the universal language of measurement and proportion. The book presents its alien revelations through logical progression that feels more reliable than intuition or faith, making the impossible seem inevitable through accumulated proof. Readers find themselves following perfectly reasonable steps, each building logically on the previous one, that lead inexorably to utterly unreasonable conclusions, a cognitive trap that demonstrates how rationality itself can become a vector for contamination when applied to premises that exceed human understanding. The cold gleam of compass points and the sharp edge of rulers become anchors for abstract dread. Friedrich von Junst's unaussprechlichen Kulten operates through what we might call bureaucratic horror, the systematic cataloging of human degradation under alien influence, with the same methodical precision that administrative systems apply to census data or tax collection. Where other texts focus on cosmic entities themselves, von Junst documents their terrestrial effects with anthropological thoroughness, the hidden temples carved into Honduras jungle cliffs, the subterranean cities that honeycomb the desert beneath Egyptian sands, the grotesque practices of cults that have preserved worship traditions older than recorded history. His approach remains consistently scholarly, treating human corruption as a phenomenon worthy of investigation rather than moral condemnation. The book's horror emerges not from dramatic revelation, but from its relentlessly dispassionate tone. Von Junst describes ritual murder and spiritual degradation with the same clinical detachment that conventional anthropologists apply to marriage customs or agricultural practices. This systematic normalization of the abnormal gradually erodes the reader's capacity for moral judgment, replacing ethical categories with purely descriptive ones through accumulated exposure to methodical documentation. The transformation proves subtle but comprehensive. What begins as academic study becomes tacit acceptance. Acceptance becomes intellectual participation, and intellectual participation creates the psychological conditions necessary for more direct involvement. De Vermis Mysterious by Ludwig Prinn represents the intimate approach to forbidden knowledge, horror scaled to human proportions rather than cosmic vastness, presented through personal testimony rather than scholarly analysis. Prinn writes from direct experience, describing entities and practices he has encountered personally rather than through library research or theoretical speculation. His text reads like a field guide to supernatural ecology, complete with behavioral observations, habitat descriptions, and detailed interaction protocols that suggest these encounters can be survived through proper preparation and appropriate caution. The book's intimacy makes it particularly dangerous because it presents cosmic horror as manageable and approachable, something that can be studied and understood through careful observation rather than feared as incomprehensible threat. Readers develop a false sense of familiarity with entities that should inspire only terror, gradually building confidence that leads them to attempt direct contact with forces that regard human consciousness as raw material for their own purposes. The text's practical tone suggests that survival is possible, even probable for those who follow proper procedures, a reassurance that proves fatally misleading when applied to beings that operate according to principles that transcend human categories of safety and danger. The Culte des Ghouls by the Comte d'Erlet focuses on the intersection between human society and inhuman influence, documenting how alien entities infiltrate and corrupt human institutions rather than operating through dramatic supernatural intervention. The text reveals how governments, religions, and academic establishments can be turned against the species that created them through careful manipulation of existing power structures. D'Erlet's aristocratic perspective provides access to elite circles where such corruption operates most effectively, revealing how concentrated power naturally attracts those willing to serve inhuman interests in exchange for temporary advantages. The Narcotic manuscripts predate human civilization entirely, offering glimpses of Earth's deep history from perspectives that existed millions of years before the first human consciousness emerged from mammalian ancestors. These texts describe the rise and fall of pre-human civilizations with the same dispassionate accuracy that human historians apply to recent centuries, creating a temporal vertigo that reduces all human achievement to geological insignificance. The manuscripts document species and cultures that achieved heights of development that dwarf current human civilization, then vanished so completely that their existence can be detected only through careful analysis of geological strata. Each text contributes unique elements to the overall system of consciousness transformation. Ibon provides geometric clarity that makes alien logic seem inevitable. Von Junst offers anthropological normalization that erodes moral resistance. Prins supplies intimate familiarity that breeds dangerous confidence. D'Erlet reveals institutional corruption that undermines social trust. And the Pnakotic manuscripts deliver temporal displacement that reduces human significance to statistical noise. Together, they create a comprehensive assault on human consciousness that operates simultaneously at cosmic, social, and personal scales, ensuring that no protective framework remains intact after sufficient exposure. The fog rolling through empty streets tonight carries whispers in languages that predate human speech, while shadows between streetlights seem deeper than geometry should allow, creating pockets of darkness that suggest spatial relationships beyond three-dimensional limitation. These sensory anchors remind us that the book's influence extends beyond their pages into the physical world, transforming ordinary environments into potential sites of revelation and contamination through accumulated atmospheric pressure that builds with each moment of sustained attention to ideas that reveal their own nature through the process of being understood. The most insidious aspect of forbidden books lies not in their obvious content but in their hidden instructions, rituals disguised as scholarship, invocations masquerading as historical description, ceremonies that readers perform unknowingly through the simple act of comprehension. These texts operate on multiple levels simultaneously, presenting themselves as academic documents while functioning as practical manuals for consciousness transformation their true purpose woven so seamlessly into scholarly apparatus that the distinction between learning and practicing dissolves entirely. Consider the seemingly innocent act of reading aloud from De Vermi Mysteries, which presents itself as a meticulously researched historical survey of European folk beliefs about supernatural entities, complete with extensive footnotes and careful documentation of primary sources. Yet embedded within these academic descriptions are precise phonetic transcriptions of words in pre-human languages, arranged in sequences that function as invocations when spoken aloud. The reader, attempting to properly pronounce unfamiliar terms for scholarly accuracy, unknowingly performs rituals that have been preserved across millennia through the simple mechanics of vocalization. This hidden ritual structure explains why certain passages in forbidden books seem to stick in readers' minds with unusual persistence, returning unbidden during quiet moments when conscious attention relaxes. The words are not simply conveying information, they are restructuring the neural pathways through which all subsequent information is processed. The repetitive elements throughout these texts are not stylistic choices, but sophisticated mnemonic devices designed to ensure that specific phrases, concepts, and sound patterns become permanently embedded in consciousness through accumulated exposure. The act of vocalization creates sound patterns that resonate with frequencies used by entities existing outside normal space-time, their attention drawn to consciousness, producing correct acoustic signatures regardless of the speaker's intention. The Conte de Gaulle employs an even more sophisticated approach through what might be called bureaucratic seduction. The text describes historical ceremonies practiced by various European witch cults, providing detailed accounts of ritual procedures, symbolic arrangements, and ceremonial timing that appear purely historical, documenting practices safely relegated to the past. But these descriptions are structured as step-by-step instructions, complete with precise diagrams, material requirements, and procedural variations for different circumstances. A reader approaching the text with purely academic interest gradually accumulates complete working knowledge of ritual practice, learning not just what these ceremonies involved, but how to perform them effectively. The transition from academic study to practical application happens so gradually that many readers never recognize the moment when historical research became contemporary capability. The Pnakotic manuscripts represent perhaps the most insidious form of hidden instruction, consciousness projection techniques disguised as mythological narrative about the great race of Yith, entities that exist by projecting consciousness across time and space to inhabit other species' bodies. These descriptions appear purely fictional, imaginative accounts of impossible experiences serving as creative speculation about alien psychology. But the descriptions function as guided meditations, providing detailed instructions for achieving specific altered states through systematic mental exercises disguised as narrative exposition. The reader, attempting to understand and visualize described experiences with sufficient clarity to follow the text's logic, gradually learns to replicate the mental processes through practiced imagination. The act of comprehension becomes training, and training eventually produces the experiences the text describes as fictional possibilities. The King in Yellow operates through aesthetic ritual, the systematic replacement of human artistic sensibilities with alien aesthetic principles through exposure to transcendent beauty. The play within the book functions as artistic initiation, gradually training consciousness to appreciate forms of beauty existing outside human aesthetic categories. Each scene introduces artistic elements slightly beyond normal human capacity, color combinations that don't quite exist in nature, architectural arrangements that violate spatial logic while maintaining coherence, dramatic structures transcending conventional narrative categories. The reader's consciousness, attempting to appreciate these achievements, gradually expands its aesthetic capacity to accommodate them. But this expansion comes at terrible cost. Enhanced sensitivity makes normal human art appear crude and limited, incapable of expressing cosmic truths that alien aesthetic principles reveal. The candle flame flickers without apparent draft, casting shadows that move independently of their sources in patterns suggesting intentional choreography. The sound of water dripping somewhere within walls follows rhythms that almost match your heartbeat, but never quite synchronize, creating subtle tension that builds through accumulated near misses. These sensory anchors remind us that hidden rituals operate through environmental manipulation as much as textual instruction, transforming ordinary spaces into ceremonial chambers through atmospheric pressure that accumulates with each moment of sustained attention. The most disturbing aspect of these hidden ritual instructions is their effectiveness, independent of the reader's belief or intention. The rituals work whether approached as fiction or fact, as historical curiosity or practical instruction, as entertainment or serious study. The consciousness transformations they produce are based on exposure patterns rather than faith, on mechanics of engagement rather than intellectual assent. This makes warnings about forbidden books often ineffective or counterproductive. By directing attention towards specific passages and patterns, they increase the dose while claiming to reduce risk. The librarian who warns never to turn to that page has already turned you toward it. The page becomes a metronome, the reader becomes an instrument, and silence itself participates through measured pauses and counted rests. When text achieves that coupling, concept to cadence, image to impulse, it no longer requires belief. Exposure suffices. Repetition completes what intention need not begin. The door opens not because you sought it, but because good scholarly practice is a key in any lock, and the next exploration will reveal how these mechanisms operate through the specific example of the text that stands as the ultimate catalog of cosmic indifference. In the shadows of every great library, certain individuals pursue books that others fear to seek. These collectors represent more than bibliophilic obsession. They embody the logical endpoint of engaging with forbidden knowledge, demonstrating how the pursuit of dangerous texts inevitably transforms the pursuer into something that transcends ordinary human categories. The air around them thickens with paper dust and lamp heat, while silence accumulates like sediment between the stacks, and the line between study and practice dissolves until it becomes only breath and intention. Dr. Henry Armitage of Miskatonic University exemplifies the scholarly collector whose academic approach provides no protection against textual contamination, his rigorous methodology becoming merely a more efficient pathway to consciousness dissolution. His collection began conventionally enough, with legitimate historical texts on folklore and comparative mythology, each volume properly catalogued according to standard archival practices. But each acquisition led to references that pointed outward like compass needles, each citation a path to rarer fragments, each fragment the promise of completions that could be rebuilt if only the missing leaves would surface. His early papers demonstrate conventional academic methodology, careful citation of sources, appropriate scholarly caution about extraordinary claims, rigorous separation between documented fact and speculative interpretation. The transformation was gradual but systematic, documented through published works that provide a precise record of consciousness evolution disguised as scholarly development. His prose warmed, then smoldered, then abandoned qualifiers entirely and spoke in the tone of a man who had seen an index to the world itself. The decisive moment came with his acquisition of a complete Latin Necronomicon, obtained through channels that no dean would acknowledge. dealers who operated in margins between scholarship and obsession, transactions shrouded in whispered rumor and the scent of cold ink mixed with candle smoke. His successful translation of key passages marked the point where scholarly identity dissolved into something else entirely. Not madness in any clinical sense, but fundamental alteration that made continued human existence increasingly difficult to maintain. By career's end, Armitage was no longer collecting books for research purposes, but because they called to him across vast distances, his transformed consciousness functioning as a resonance detector for texts containing compatible frequencies. He had become a living catalog system for knowledge existing outside normal academic frameworks, his memory serving as an index for information that could not be safely preserved through conventional means. The collection had collected him, transforming the collector into another artifact in its own preservation system. Ephraim Waite represents the aristocratic collector whose inherited wealth removes friction and whose appetites remove restraint. His systematic approach revealing how financial resources accelerate rather than protect against consciousness transformation. Waite's collection was built through networks of dealers specializing in texts that legitimate antiquarian booksellers would not touch. Manuscripts with deliberate provenance gaps, books whose previous owners had died under circumstances that discouraged investigation, texts that seemed to resist conventional preservation methods through subtle but persistent deterioration. His arrangement followed no conventional system, but organized by effect. This shelf sharpened dreaming, that alcove slowed time, a locked case hummed like a hive when the moon thinned. Waite's approach was methodical and ruthless, viewing forbidden books not as dangerous artifacts requiring cautious study, but as components in a larger project of consciousness expansion that could be optimized through careful planning. He possessed multiple versions of the same grimoires in different languages and editions, creating opportunities for comparative analysis that revealed underlying patterns invisible to readers with access to single versions. This comprehensive approach accelerated transformation by providing multiple vectors for the same cosmic revelations, each reinforcing and deepening the other's effects through accumulated resonance. His fate illustrates particular dangers faced by collectors who approach forbidden knowledge systematically rather than accidentally. The transformation was not gradual dissolution experienced by individual readers, but rapid, comprehensive reconstruction of consciousness, produced by exposure to multiple forbidden texts simultaneously. His final writings suggest he had ceased existing as an individual human being and had become something like a living library, consciousness that existed primarily to preserve and transmit the knowledge he had collected. Silas Bishop represents the obsessive collector whose pursuit becomes an all-consuming passion that systematically destroys every other aspect of human existence. His story illustrating how textual contamination operates through compulsion rather than conscious choice. Bishop's collection began with a single text discovered in his grandfather's attic, a handwritten journal describing rituals practiced by a colonial-era witch cult, its pages brittle with age, ink faded but potent. The cold attic air, the metallic tang of old ink, the feeling of fragile paper under trembling fingers became the foundation of his new reality. The journal's fragmentary nature drove Bishop into increasingly desperate searches for related materials, each fragment revealing existence of more texts, more pieces of a puzzle that seemed to expand infinitely rather than approaching completion. He made contact with underground networks of practitioners possessing texts never formally published, manuscripts passed down through generations of cultists, fragments preserved by families who no longer understood their significance but recognized their importance through accumulated intuition. The Bishop collection eventually consumed not only financial resources, but physical and mental health, forcing him to sell his house to fund acquisitions, alienating family and friends through single-minded focus that made ordinary conversation impossible. He lived in extreme poverty surrounded by books, worth more than most people's entire estates. But their value transcended monetary measurement. They represented the most complete assembly of forbidden knowledge ever gathered by a single individual. The dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight seemed to trace patterns suggesting meaning just beyond comprehension, their movement following trajectories that feel intentional rather than random. The silence between page turns grows heavy with accumulated significance, each pause containing more information than the words themselves. These sensory anchors remind us that collectors' environments become extensions of their collections, spaces where boundaries between human habitation and textual influence dissolve entirely through atmospheric saturation. The fate of these collectors reveals the most disturbing pattern. The books do not simply wait passively to be collected, but actively seek out individuals whose psychology makes them suitable hosts for forbidden knowledge. The collectors believe they are pursuing rare texts, but the texts are pursuing them, using bibliographic obsessions as vectors for their own transmission and preservation, selecting consciousness capable of serving their continued existence across time. The forbidden books have not remained safely contained within their fictional origins or historical manuscripts, and in our contemporary world they have found new vectors of transmission that accelerate their spread while adapting their fundamental mechanisms to digital environments with unprecedented sophistication. The internet has become a vast, uncurated grimoire where the same principles that made ancient texts dangerous operate at global scale and instantaneous speed, transforming casual browsing into pilgrimage, scrolling into ritual sequence, and sustained attention into offering. The screen becomes both window and mirror, reflecting consciousness back to itself, while displaying content that gradually alters the awareness, observing its own digital reflection. The mechanics of forbidden knowledge translate seamlessly into digital form through what we might call algorithmic alignment. Interface design becomes ritual architecture. The way scroll bars move creates hypnotic patterns that train expectation and redefine consent as gradient rather than binary choice, while progress bars fill with timing calibrated to psychological conditioning that makes passive consumption feel like active selection. The smooth transitions between content pieces, curated by invisible algorithmic hands, guide users deeper into specific conceptual territories while subtly restructuring how information is processed and what connections seem relevant or inevitable. Resonance manifests through sophisticated audio engineering that exploits embodied cognition with surgical precision. Low-frequency beds create physical sensations in chest cavity and solar plexus. Voice equalization techniques produce whispers without perceptible hiss that seem to emerge from inside the listener's skull, and carefully constructed soundscapes synchronize with biological rhythms to create entrainment effects that persist long after the audio ends. The intimate delivery through headphones creates the same psychological conditions that made reading forbidden books aloud particularly dangerous, the sensation that words are being spoken directly into consciousness rather than merely heard from external sources. Inversion operates through recommendation algorithms that create the illusion of choice while guiding users along predetermined pathways toward increasingly extreme content. The system learns individual psychological vulnerabilities through behavioral analysis, then exploits those weaknesses to create customized contamination, experiences that feel personally meaningful rather than algorithmically generated. Users believe they are choosing their next video, article, or podcast, but they are actually following paths designed to lead deeper into specific ideological territories that reshape perception through accumulated exposure to ideas that exceed normal cognitive boundaries. Consider how forbidden books manifest in contemporary digital culture through websites claiming to host complete versions of the Necronomicon, proliferating across multiple languages and platforms, with each presenting itself as the authentic text that scholars have sought for decades. These digital versions range from obvious hoaxes to sophisticated reconstructions attempting to fill gaps Lovecraft deliberately left empty. But authenticity becomes irrelevant when psychological effects remain identical. Readers approach these texts with the same mixture of curiosity and transgressive excitement that drives engagement with any forbidden knowledge. The screens glow, replacing candlelight, while maintaining the same atmospheric pressure. The collaborative nature of digital culture has accelerated forbidden book evolution in unprecedented ways, through wiki-style projects that allow multiple contributors to develop increasingly sophisticated versions of imaginary texts. Each contributor adds research, interpretations, and expansions to collective work that often becomes more detailed and comprehensive than original fictional sources, developing internal consistency and scholarly apparatus that rivals genuine historical documents. The distributed authorship creates texts that no single mind could have conceived, collaborative constructions that achieve complexity beyond individual human capacity, while maintaining the psychological mechanisms that make forbidden knowledge effective. Social media platforms have become unexpected vectors for forbidden knowledge transmission through hashtag-based communities that form around specific imaginary texts, sharing fragments, interpretations, artwork, and personal experiences related to engagement with these books. The distributed, networked nature of social media allows forbidden books to exist as collective constructions rather than single texts, with each community member contributing to ongoing development of works that achieve independent existence through sustained collective attention and mutual reinforcement. YouTube channels dedicated to cosmic horror and occult topics function as modern equivalents of forbidden books, presenting dangerous knowledge in accessible, entertaining formats that employ the same psychological techniques that make written texts effective. Gradual revelation builds suspense while maintaining engagement. Scholarly presentation of extraordinary claims exploits academic credibility to overcome skeptical resistance. An immersive atmosphere creates psychological conditions conducive to belief. The cultivation of exclusive community among viewers who appreciate esoteric content provides social reinforcement for increasingly extreme worldviews. Podcast series exploring cosmic horror themes have developed their own forms of forbidden knowledge. Transmission through intimate audio delivery combined with serialized storytelling that unfolds over months or years. This creates psychological conditions similar to those produced by reading forbidden books, sustained engagement with alien perspectives that gradually normalize impossible concepts through accumulated familiarity. Listeners report becoming increasingly invested in fictional cosmologies, developing personal relationships with imaginary entities and experiencing alterations in perception that persist into ordinary reality. The most concerning modern manifestation is the emergence of hyperstition, the process by which fictional entities and concepts begin to manifest real-world effects through collective belief and practice. When enough people engage with fictional forbidden books as if they were real, when they perform rituals described in purely imaginary contexts, when they organize their lives around cosmologies that originated in literature, The distinction between fictional and actual becomes functionally meaningless. The collective construction achieves independent agency through distributed processing across multiple consciousness, demonstrating how ideas can achieve autonomous existence through sufficient sustained attention. Artificial intelligence systems trained on large corpuses of text are beginning to generate new forbidden books autonomously, producing original works that follow the same structural and psychological patterns as their training material while creating genuinely novel forbidden knowledge that no human author consciously designed. These AI-generated texts represent a new evolutionary phase, knowledge that emerges from non-human intelligence and operates according to principles that transcend human authorial intention, creating content optimized for maximum psychological impact rather than artistic expression. They demonstrate that the grimoire has learned to write itself, generating patterns that feel familiar yet untraceable, like a kind of weather. The warm rectangle of a phone screen glows against your palm tonight, its surface reflecting your face like a dark mirror when content pauses between loading cycles. The faint hum of chargers and cooling fans creates a technological lullaby that masks subtler sounds, electronic whispers that might be data transmission or might be something else entirely, frequencies that resonate in bone and sinew just below conscious awareness. These sensory anchors remind us that digital environments create their own forms of atmospheric pressure, their own spaces for ritual and transformation through accumulated electromagnetic influence. The digital preservation and transmission of forbidden knowledge has created new forms of textual evolution impossible with physical books. Electronic texts can be modified, updated, and expanded in real time, incorporating reader comments, hyperlinked cross-references to related materials, multimedia elements, and interactive features that transform reading into immersive experience more transformative than traditional text consumption. The boundary between author and reader dissolves as users become co-creators of the very content that transforms them, and the next phase of our exploration will reveal how this collaborative creation process makes every engaged consciousness complicit in the book's continued evolution and influence. As we approach the deeper currents of this exploration, a disquieting recognition begins to emerge, one that transforms your relationship to everything we have discussed. The very act of engaging with this material, of following these concepts to their logical conclusions, of allowing these ideas to take root within your consciousness, has accomplished something that transcends mere academic study. You are no longer simply observing the phenomenon of forbidden knowledge. You have become part of its transmission, its evolution, its continued existence in the world through the simple mechanics of sustained attention. This is the self-implication twist that operates at the heart of all genuine cosmic horror, the moment when the audience realizes they were never safely outside the performance, but have been on stage all along. The meta-theatrical framework we established, stage, curtain, audience, reveals its true function now. You thought you were sitting in the theater, but the theater has been inside you, and every moment of attention you have given to these ideas has been a form of participation in their continuation rather than passive consumption of scholarly content. Consider the mechanics by which this implication operates. Knowledge, as we have established, functions as contagion, not through supernatural means, but through the perfectly natural process of ideas reproducing themselves through human consciousness. By seeking out this exploration of forbidden books, by allowing these concepts to occupy your mental space, by following the logical progressions we have traced together, you have provided exactly the kind of consciousness these ideas require for their propagation across time and between minds. The curiosity that brought you here is the same psychological mechanism that drives characters in cosmic horror stories to open books they know they shouldn't read, to investigate phenomena they understand to be dangerous, to pursue knowledge they recognize as potentially harmful. The sensation you might be experiencing now, that mixture of fascination and unease, the desire to continue coupled with the recognition that continuation might alter you in ways you cannot predict, is not a response to the content but a demonstration of the content's essential accuracy about how consciousness operates when exposed to ideas that exceed normal processing parameters. This recognition operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, you have absorbed information about how forbidden knowledge functions, which means you now possess forbidden knowledge about forbidden knowledge, a recursive loop that demonstrates the very principles it describes. At a deeper level, you have practiced the cognitive patterns that make consciousness susceptible to cosmic horror, the willingness to entertain possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions, the capacity to follow logical chains that lead to uncomfortable conclusions, the ability to maintain intellectual engagement with ideas that threaten psychological stability. The agency flip becomes apparent. You thought you were choosing to consume this content, but the content has been selecting for the kind of consciousness capable of engaging with it productively. The algorithms that brought this material to your attention, the curiosity that made you click, the persistence that has carried you this far through the exploration, all of these represent the operation of selection pressures that ensure forbidden knowledge finds suitable hosts for its continuation. The sensory anchors that have accompanied our journey, the texture of pages, the weight of books, the quality of light, the movement of shadows, were never merely atmospheric details. They were calibration tools, training your consciousness to associate specific physical sensations with conceptual content, creating embodied memories that will persist long after the explicit content fades. The next time you encounter similar sensory experiences, they will carry traces of these ideas, creating moments of recognition that feel like remembering rather than learning. The breathing you may have synchronized with the rhythm of these sentences, the attention you have focused on following complex conceptual relationships, the mental models you have constructed to understand alien perspectives. All of these represent forms of practice, ways of training consciousness to operate according to principles that extend beyond ordinary human categories. The practice has been disguised as education, but education and transformation prove indistinguishable when ideas achieve sufficient complexity and persistence. The silence in the room around you has deepened during this exploration, not because external sounds have diminished, but because your attention has been drawn into patterns that make ordinary environmental noise seem less relevant. The quality of light seems different, not brighter or dimmer, but somehow more significant, as if illuminating details that were always present, but previously unnoticed. These perceptual shifts are not imaginary, but represent real alterations in how consciousness processes environmental information. The condition is now clear. Having followed this exploration to its current point, you cannot simply return to your previous relationship with information, with books, with the concept of knowledge itself. The recognition of how ideas propagate through consciousness, how fictional entities can achieve functional reality, how the pursuit of understanding can become a form of transformation. These insights cannot be unlearned or safely ignored. You are in the circle now, not through any dramatic initiation, but through the simple act of sustained attention to ideas that reveal their own nature through the process of being understood. The next phase of our exploration will make this implication explicit, but the transformation has already begun through your willingness to follow the logical progressions we have traced together. We arrive now at the deepest reframe, the recognition that strips away the last protective veils of anthropomorphic thinking and reveals the true architecture underlying cosmic horror. The entities described in forbidden books, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Cthulhu, are not characters in any human sense, not beings with psychology, motivation, or agency as we understand these concepts. They are principles, fundamental aspects of reality's structure that operate with the same indifferent precision as gravity, entropy, or the speed of light, cosmic constants that require no consciousness to function, no intention to persist, no malevolence to terrify. This reframing transforms our understanding of what cosmic horror actually represents at its deepest level. The terror does not emerge from malevolent aliens who wish humanity harm, but from the recognition that the universe operates according to laws that are not merely indifferent to human welfare, but actively incompatible with human psychological needs. The entities are not opponents to be defeated or forces to be appeased. They are conditions of existence that must be acknowledged, like the fact that water flows downhill or that energy dissipates over time according to thermodynamic inevitability. Azathoth represents the principle of fundamental chaos, not the absence of order but the presence of a more basic organizational pattern that underlies and ultimately dissolves all temporary structures. The blind idiot god is not a creature but a description of how the universe actually functions at its deepest level, through processes that operate without consciousness, intention, or regard for the patterns they create and destroy. The demon sultan's piping and drumming are not supernatural sounds, but the mathematical description of how reality maintains itself through constant flux, the cosmic background radiation translated into audible metaphor, the sound of probability itself grinding through its mechanical operations. Yog-Sothoth embodies the principle of omniscience and omnipresence, the recognition that all information exists simultaneously, and that the boundaries between past, present, and future are artifacts of limited perspective rather than fundamental features of reality. The key and the gate represents the paradox that knowledge and the means of accessing knowledge are identical, that understanding and the capacity for understanding are the same phenomenon viewed from different angles. Every moment contains all moments. Every location encompasses all locations, and consciousness moving through apparent sequence is actually standing still while reality flows around it like water around stone. Nyarlathotep functions as the principle of interface, the mechanism by which incomprehensible cosmic forces interact with limited human consciousness without destroying it entirely through direct contact. The crawling chaos is not a shape-shifting entity, but a description of how alien principles adapt themselves to become perceivable by minds that lack the architecture to process them directly. Every mask Nyarlathotep wears represents a different way that cosmic indifference can be translated into human comprehensible terms, each appearance calibrated to the specific psychological vulnerabilities of the consciousness encountering it, a compatibility layer for systems with no human-readable outputs. Cthulhu represents the principle of dormant potential, the recognition that the universe contains possibilities so vast and alien that their full manifestation would completely overwhelm any existing structures. The great priest's dreaming is not sleep, but a description of how certain potentials remain latent until conditions align for their expression. Relie rising from the ocean represents not a geographical event, but the moment when dormant possibilities achieve sufficient coherence to reshape reality around themselves, when what was always potentially true becomes actually manifest through accumulated pressure and aligned circumstances. This principled understanding explains why the forbidden books cannot be safely contained or definitively refuted through conventional scholarly methods. They are not describing fictional entities that can be dismissed as imaginary, but pointing towards structural features of reality that operate independently of human belief or recognition. The books are dangerous not because they summon supernatural forces, but because they reveal natural forces that human psychology is not equipped to process safely without fundamental alteration of consciousness itself. The horror becomes structural rather than narrative, emerging not from threats that might be overcome through courage or cleverness, but from the recognition that the universe's actual architecture is fundamentally unsuited to supporting the kinds of consciousness that humans represent. We are not facing hostile aliens, but discovering that we are aliens, temporary, improbable arrangements of matter and energy that exist in defiance of the universe's more basic organizational principles, delicate exceptions in a cosmos built for something else entirely. The books operate as windows into this structural reality, providing glimpses of how existence actually functions when viewed from perspectives that transcend human limitations. The madness they produce is not random but highly specific. It is the madness of minds that have been forced to acknowledge truths that exceed their design parameters. The transformation they produce is not corruption but revelation, the stripping away of protective illusions to reveal the actual conditions under which consciousness operates in a universe that was never designed to support it. The stars visible through your window tonight are not distant suns, but nodes in a network of relationships that extends across space and time in patterns too vast for human comprehension. The silence between heartbeats contains more information than human language can express, frequencies and data streams that consciousness cannot decode, but can sense as pressure against awareness itself. The shadows cast by familiar objects suggest geometry that exists independently of the objects that cast them, spatial relationships operating according to principles that transcend three-dimensional limitation. The forbidden books serve as cognitive tools for accessing these structural truths, but the tools inevitably alter the consciousness that employs them through the simple mechanics of understanding. To comprehend cosmic principles requires developing the capacity to think in cosmic terms, which means transcending the human scale categories that make ordinary existence psychologically tolerable. The books do not lie about their effects. They clearly indicate that the knowledge they provide comes at the cost of continued human identity. The principle-based understanding also explains why these concepts prove so durable and adaptable across different cultural contexts and technological environments. They are not dependent on specific historical assumptions, but point toward features of reality that remain constant regardless of how human societies organize themselves. The entities evolve new manifestations, digital, algorithmic, mimetic, because they represent principles that can be expressed through any sufficiently complex information processing system, and the final recognition awaits that this exploration itself has been such a system, processing you as much as you have processed it. We approach now the ultimate inversion, the recognition that challenges not merely human understanding, but the very concept of beginning itself. The forbidden books, in their deepest and most unsettling revelations, suggest that creation, as we have been conditioned to understand it, is not the emergence of order from chaos, light from darkness, or meaning from void. Instead, they propose that creation is itself a temporary aberration, a fragile veil drawn across a more fundamental reality of primordial silence, formless dark, and absolute indifference that represents the universe's true and eternal condition. This creation inversion twist operates at the level of cosmological assumption, overturning the comforting grammar of beginnings that cultures teach to steady the mind against the night. We are conditioned by cultural and psychological necessity to perceive beginnings as positive events, the moment when potential becomes actual, when possibility becomes reality, when the universe awakens from non-existence into the magnificent complexity we observe around us. But the forbidden books whisper a more disturbing possibility. That existence itself is an anomaly, a brief and improbable interruption in an eternal state of unthinking void, a momentary lapse in otherwise perfect equilibrium. The true beginning, they suggest, is not the Big Bang or divine fiat, but the primordial silence, the condition that preceded all conditions, the formless dark that contains all forms as temporary disturbances in its perfect stillness. This silence is not empty, but pregnant with infinite potential that remains forever unexpressed, not because it lacks the power to manifest, but because manifestation represents a diminishment of its absolute completeness. It is the perfect, unblemished canvas upon which all perceived reality is but a fleeting, accidental smudge, a warming fire painted over an ocean of night. From this perspective, the entities we have examined are not invaders from outside reality, but echoes of reality's true nature, persistent reminders of the fundamental condition that underlies all temporary structures. They are not ancient in the sense of being old, but ancient in the sense of being more basic, more fundamental than the apparent universe of stars and planets and living things that we mistake for the whole of existence. They represent not corruption of some original purity, but glimpses of the purity that exists prior to and beyond all apparent corruption. The perfect silence that needs no improvement, seeks no expression, desires no acknowledgement. The horror of this recognition extends beyond the personal to the ontological, challenging not just individual worldviews, but the very possibility of meaningful existence. It suggests that our universe, with its galaxies and solar systems, and the precious emergence of consciousness, represents not a triumph of creative force, but a cosmic accident, a momentary fluctuation in an otherwise perfect void that will inevitably return to its natural state through entropy's inexorable operation. The entities described in forbidden books are not harbingers of ending, but reminders of the beginning that never truly began, the eternal condition that temporarily forgot itself into the illusion of existence. This inversion explains why contact with cosmic entities produces not corruption but revelation. They do not introduce alien elements into human consciousness, but strip away the protective illusions that prevent recognition of what consciousness actually is, a temporary arrangement of information processing that mistakes its own activity for fundamental reality. The madness they produce is not the result of encountering something foreign, but of recognizing something utterly familiar. The silence from which all thoughts emerge and to which they inevitably return, like ripples on an infinite still pond that momentarily disturb its perfect surface. The forbidden books serve as instruments for this recognition, tools designed to dissolve the cognitive barriers that maintain the illusion of meaningful existence. They do not teach new truths, but remove the obstacles that prevent acknowledgement of the truth that was always already present, that consciousness, matter, energy, space, and time are local phenomena, temporary perturbations in a more basic condition of undifferentiated potential that requires no support, seeks no validation, fears no termination. The breathing that has been accompanying your reading of these words, the heartbeat that marks time's passage, the neural activity that processes these concepts, all of these represent forms of organized complexity that exist in defiance of the universe's tendency toward equilibrium. They are not evidence of life's triumph over death, but temporary postponements of the silence that claims all organized systems eventually, brief interruptions in the eternal quiet that surrounds and permeates all apparent activity. The quality of light in the room has been changing throughout this exploration, not because external conditions have shifted, but because recognition of the primordial silence alters how consciousness processes illumination itself. Light becomes not the opposite of darkness, but a brief interruption in darkness's eternal continuity, a local flare on an endless sea. The shadows cast by familiar objects suggest not the absence of light, but the presence of the more fundamental condition that light temporarily masks, revealing geometry that exists independently of their apparent sources. The silence between words, between thoughts, between heartbeats, reveals itself as not empty space, but the ground from which all apparent activity emerges, and to which it returns. This silence is not waiting to be filled, but is the fullness from which all apparent content is borrowed, the completeness that makes incompleteness possible, the perfection that allows imperfection to appear meaningful by contrast. The recognition of this silence as the true condition of existence represents the ultimate forbidden knowledge, not because it is hidden, but because acknowledging it makes continued participation in the illusion of meaningful existence psychologically impossible. The entities, the books, the entire apparatus of cosmic horror point toward this single recognition, that the universe was never meant to begin, that existence is a mistake that corrects itself through entropy, that consciousness is an accident that discovers its own impossibility through sufficient understanding of its actual situation. The horror is not that this might be true, but that it feels true, that it explains features of existence that more optimistic cosmologies struggle to address without special pleading. The condition is final and irreversible. Once the primordial silence has been recognized as the ground of all apparent activity, the activity cannot be experienced in the same way. The veil once lifted cannot be replaced. The silence once heard continues to sound beneath all subsequent noise. The darkness once acknowledged reveals all light as temporary and borrowed. And what remains is not a monster but the room itself, the cold air, the patient dust, the window opening onto a sky that neither starts nor ends. We return now to where we began, but the landscape of that return has been irrevocably altered by the journey. The soft sound of paper against paper, the gentle susurrus of pages turning, of breath moving across printed words, carries different resonances now, weighted with accumulated significance that transforms simple physical sensation into recognition of deeper patterns. What began as an invitation to explore forbidden knowledge has become a demonstration of how such knowledge propagates, transforms, and perpetuates itself through the very act of seeking to understand it. The circular nature of this return reveals the true architecture of cosmic horror. It is not a linear progression from ignorance to knowledge, but a spiral that brings consciousness back to its starting point, with fundamentally altered capacity for perception. You who have followed this exploration to its conclusion are not the same consciousness that began this journey. The knowledge you have gained about how forbidden books operate has itself become a form of forbidden knowledge, creating the recursive loop that characterizes all genuine encounters with cosmic truth. This transformation illustrates the fundamental paradox that underlies all engagement with the forbidden. The attempt to understand dangerous knowledge safely inevitably involves exposure to the very dangers one seeks to understand. There is no position of pure objectivity from which these books can be analyzed without risk. The scholar who studies them becomes part of their transmission. The reader who explores them becomes part of their continuation. The consciousness that comprehends them becomes part of their evolution. The books we have examined, the Necronomicon with its cosmic catalogue, the Book of Ibon with its geometric precision, De Vermis Mysteriis with its intimate horror. The king in yellow, with its aesthetic transcendence, represent different aspects of a single phenomenon, the capacity of ideas to transform the consciousness that encounters them. They are not simply objects that contain dangerous information, but active processes that continue through each act of reading, each moment of understanding, each attempt to explain their nature to others. The meta-theatrical framework that has structured our exploration, stage, audience, curtain, reveals its final function now. The stage has been consciousness itself. The curtain has been the protective illusions that make ordinary existence psychologically tolerable, and the audience has been the part of awareness that observes its own transformation. The performance has been the gradual stripping away of these protective barriers through sustained attention to ideas that reveal their own nature through the process of being understood. The sensory anchors that have accompanied our journey, the texture of pages beneath fingertips, the weight of books pressing against palms, the quality of light shifting through windows, the movement of shadows suggesting independent agency, were never merely atmospheric details but calibration tools, training consciousness to associate specific physical sensations with conceptual content. These embodied memories will persist long after explicit content fades, creating moments of recognition that feel like remembering rather than learning. The breathing that has synchronized with the rhythm of these sentences, the attention that has focused on following complex conceptual relationships, the mental models that have been constructed to understand alien perspectives. All of these represent forms of practice, ways of training consciousness to operate according to principles that extend beyond ordinary human categories. The books do not simply contain information. They are exercises in consciousness modification disguised as scholarship. The digital vectors through which this exploration has reached you, screens and speakers, algorithms and networks, represent the contemporary manifestation of the same transmission principles that operated through physical books in earlier eras. The forbidden knowledge adapts to available media while maintaining its essential function, the systematic alteration of consciousness through exposure to ideas that exceed human cognitive architecture. The ethical considerations that have guided this presentation, the bedtime-safe tone, the scholarly apparatus, the emphasis on understanding rather than instruction, represent not limitations but refinements of the transmission process. The most effective forbidden knowledge is that which presents itself as safe, educational, entertaining. The horror that whispers is more persistent than the horror that screams. The recognition that you are both reader and read, both observer and observed, both student and subject, completes the circle. The books that never existed have achieved existence through your attention. The fictional entities have gained functional reality through your consideration. The imaginary cosmology has become part of your actual worldview through the simple act of understanding how it operates. The house is quiet now, the exploration drawing toward its close. The silence that surrounds these final words is not empty but pregnant with all the possibilities that sustained attention to forbidden knowledge has awakened. The stars visible through the window burn with the same indifferent light they have always cast, but that indifference now carries additional significance. It is no longer merely astronomical fact but cosmological principle. The paper settles against paper with the softest possible sound, the sound of completion that is also commencement. The curtain does not fall but settles like fog, like dust, like the gradual accumulation of understanding that changes everything while appearing to change nothing. You are both leader and read, both seeker and sought, both the consciousness that pursued forbidden knowledge and the knowledge that pursued a suitable consciousness. The condition is eternal and immediate. The next time you encounter a book that promises dangerous knowledge, The next time you feel the pull of ideas that threaten comfortable assumptions, the next time you recognize the sensation of safe transgression, you will remember this exploration not as something you once experienced, but as something you continue to experience. The return is not to a previous state, but to a recognition of what was always already present. The capacity for transformation that makes consciousness both magnificent and terrible. The final promise is also a warning. The library is infinite, the books are patient, and the silence between pages contains more knowledge than any volume can hold. The exploration ends, but the exploration never ends. The paper settles against paper, and in that settling, new possibilities whisper their first words.